The reason why I chose the tree as an image has nothing to do with any iconographic significance or symbolic or even cultural significance. It was an image, it's a structure that fed into, that allowed me to employ a theoretical strategy with respect to the production of images, and particularly the production of images in art. And essentially it was an idea, had to do with an idea of how to realize an object in the world within a mathematical form or geometric form. And so the mathematics that I used was a grid. Anyway, the plane is a grid plane. So the idea was to realize the image of a tree within the grid, on a grid, using the language of the mathematics of the grid. And so people think about that translation as a kind of pixelization or digitalization, I'll put it that way, of an image that we commonly know with respect to computer imagery these days. And but when I started my work, the Grid series, it was back in 1972, and although there were computers, the idea of the digital image was in its infancy. So I didn't think about the strategy that I was using as a kind of computer realization. I thought about it as a geometry, a way of geometrically spatializing an object like a tree. So the fact that it was a tree was important to me because of the structure itself. So I needed an object that had such a form, but a complex form. I was a bit more interested in a complex linear form, and because then in the translation I could draw or copy the linear shape of the tree form onto a grid and convert the lines of that form into numbers, so that at the end, what you have a series of numbers that aggregate to the form of a tree. It had to do with the issue of representation. My larger interest was to show that in works of art, forms and gestures can be created not from what's called the creative imagination, but from a system. And say pixelating the shape of a tree on a grid, or using the mathematics of a grid to break down the shape or reassign the shape in terms of numbers, allowed the tree to be given over to its use, the form's use to be given over to a system rather than my creative imagination. So the idea was to show, was to be able to realize a work of art, to make a work of art, without using the creative imagination, without using the subjective unconscious, by allowing the work of art to be made by a system. And so my tree was, as a form, was essentially a tool to try to get to that critical end. There might be an assumption that because people realize the works, that by their very presence, that's subjectivity is at work, and so I don't agree with that. I mean, like, it presupposes subjectivity in the pure presence of the person, and so that's an idea that needs to be unpacked a little bit. So it tries to explain certain notions of our individuality and identity. So what we see, therefore, and in order to do this, in order to explain it, we look at what people produce. And sometimes what they produce are not called expressions, and sometimes what they produce are called expressions. So a human being, an individual human being, by being constitutively a person, does not equate automatically subjectivity, because it depends upon naming that experience and what they produce. All right. So there is, so within the realm of art, the assumption is not that because it's made by a person, the object is the consequence of a subjective expression. It's through the means of expression that's called subjective. If I say something in response to a question, that response, the fact that I respond is not thought to be a subjective construct, but what I'm saying might be. It might be. All right. It might not be too. So, for example, if you ask a mathematician a question about mathematics, you don't expect that answer to be subjective, because the nature of subjectivity is that it's unique. It's expected that things are different between individuals, and uniquely different between individuals. And to ask a mathematician to be subjective is fine, but it's not mathematics, because so mathematics is given over to another, so let's say another process, a rational process. With respect to works of art, if you ask a work of art, if you ask an artist to respond to something, that response is the work of art. Or the artist himself can, by his or her own will, respond. And it's a work of art. The assumption is that it's a work of art because the response is inevitably subjective. My problem was with the idea that a work of art should be defined as a subjective process, that unless it's subjective, it's not a work of art. And in the early days, when I was investigating this work, I discovered that there are plenty of places in the world where art is produced, but there's no such idea as subjectivity, no idea of subjective expression, no idea of intuition. There may be corollary ideas that are similar, but the essential sort of framework that we understand, by which we understand those ideas, comes out of Western knowledge and Western thought. So it's clear that you can make art without those ideas. I mean, unless you say that only the Western world makes art and everybody else doesn't, then it would be a pretty ridiculous thing to say. But otherwise, you don't need it. And that led to my experiments in terms of using sort of mathematical processes, because these processes, mathematics and geometry, are not thought to be subjective process. And so the question is, can you make a work of art through that process, rather than rely on the idea of my intuition? In my series, there is information that I use that comes from photography, and there's graphic information, using acrylic paint. And so when I came up with this idea of the tree, it really originated photographically. A lot of people assume or have learned some way that the process that I went through in realizing this idea came through painting, and it didn't. It came through conceptual art. It came through photography. So the earliest images was that I placed the grid over the photographic image of the tree, and as I said, the process, is about filling in the individual cells of the grid with numbers, and in the series that I have downstairs is filled in also with colors, with paint, where the shape of the tree falls on the grid, and the aggregation of those marks produced a form. Later, I removed the photograph and replaced it with what I called an exploded image of the tree that we make with acrylic paint. It might be imagined that there's a critique of painting in this process, and in many ways I think there is, but it didn't start out that way. At a certain point in my life with the work, I discovered that people were having trouble naming it, and out of convenience, a lot of people refer to them as paintings. And I always make the point, they're not paintings, but people want to, because they want to say that. I discovered that in that way, this is an interesting critique of painting, and actually one that I was involved in with respect to my larger critique, which had to do with representation. That this association of the subjective and conscious in drawing with represented objects in that medium. I had to, as I said, I had this critique that those forms don't have to be produced by the creative imagination as a process. So as I've discovered as part of that critique, I could think about the way we define a painting, that, well, in face of my work, I'll have pretty much all the constituent properties of a painting, but it remains difficult to call it that, And so it critiques the idea, that modernist idea of painting. This is something that I didn't think about at the time, but I've come to realize over time, and I'm glad about it, because I think a painting is part of the tradition in modernism of placing the notion of this expressive unconscious and the expressive imagination, placing that notion on a pedestal as being pivotal to the production of art. So I think painting has played a serious role in establishing that concept. So I'm glad that those boundaries to the concept somewhat being exposed by my work. A lot of people ask me, since a part of my practice involves music, how has music played, no pun intended, in the realization of my work. And since I was trained as a musician, I thought it was a relevant question, particularly with respect to my own thoughts on the matter and the history of my work. I was never, although I was involved in music all my life, I've never thought that actually music would ever be a part of my visual practice. I didn't know, for years I didn't see how it could be. And I think pretty much because my work was never performative. If I had been a performance artist, I think the idea of the music would have worked in much sooner. It came to me when I finally did develop a piece where I actually used some of my music training. And that work was from a series called Manifestos. And in that work, what I do is that I use a system to translate the letters from a text into musical notation. So again, in that, there is a system. That musical notation then produces melodies. That translation produces melodies. In the work itself, the way that people experience the work is through an installation where they can see a video that scrolls the political text and hear music that text produced through that system. It's essentially what we do is when I finish the musical translation, I write that translation in terms of an arrangement for instrument or instruments, and then we record it. And then in the installation, we make that the soundtrack of a scrolling text. And you see both these things at the same time. when I had this idea of the piece and I made the first experiments with it, I discovered that it did something similar to what I thought was going on in the visual work, and that is producing this affective experience, but through a system. So there I saw what the relationship was, that at no time in my experience of music was I unaware of the curious relationship between notation and sound. That the notation is systematic, and sound is, is not. I mean, sound produces oral, audio signals that you interpret from the creative imagination if you're dealing with it as a work of art, and that's always the property. You can tell two different people to arrange 5 notes according to their own whim, and then identify a certain kind of stylistic effect in the way each arranges their notes. To me, what's important about that is that they're coming from the same 5 notes. Now, I'm interested, but less interested in the phenomenon of what's produced by that arrangement. Everybody forgets that everybody has the systematic restriction of the 5 notes. They only think about what's produced, and have, because of that separation, can enjoy these grandiose myths about the creative imagination and so forth, when in fact one is working within a quite constrained and quite limited system, and that system that you use produce, rather than your creative imagination, it produces the effects that you experience. The myth is that their imagination is responsible for what you experience. And to a small degree that might be true, but to a large degree, it's the form itself. The musical form I use is the diatonic scale, and it's written and it was created for the purpose of harmony, to produce the most pleasant, at least in terms of history of Western music, the most pleasant sequence of notes. And the viewer finds meaning in that because of their own cultural history with music, with Western musical forms. Probably, if you were from another culture and never heard Western music, you would be hearing something that sounds quite different. But it's wholly and fully dependent upon your experience at listening for this experience to be meaningful. You could hear something, but then is it meaningful? And for it to be meaningful, in this case, it showed me that it was coming out of heavily out of culture, not out of some universal idea of form.